The sky was a sea of wings. From horizon to horizon, thousands of aircraft droned eastward, C-47 Dakotas in tight formation, towing gliders heavy with jeeps, artillery, and soldiers. Below them, the green patchwork of the English countryside gave way to the blue-gray shimmer of the North Sea. It was September 17th, 1944, and the largest airborne operation in human history was underway. To those who watched from the ground, it looked like victory itself, soaring toward the heart of Europe. For the men aboard those planes, the mood was a volatile mix of fear and exhilaration. Many believed they were about to deliver the decisive blow that would end the war by Christmas. "We thought we were going home soon," one British paratrooper later recalled. "No more trenches, no more blood, just one last push, and it'd all be over." They were young, most barely in their 20s, and full of the confidence that had carried the Allies across France in a triumphant summer offensive. But the war, as history has always proven, is rarely kind to optimism. Operation Market Garden was the brainchild of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the famously audacious British commander who believed in striking boldly when others hesitated. His plan was dazzling in scope. 3 airborne divisions would drop deep into Nazi-occupied Holland, seize a corridor of key bridges over the Maas, Wall, and Rhine rivers, and hold them until British ground forces, the XX Corps, could fight their way north to link up. Once across the Rhine, the Allies could bypass the Siegfried Line, sweep into the Ruhr, and bring Germany to its knees. It was, on paper, a masterstroke swift, surgical, and decisive. But it was also perilously dependent on precision and timing. Every objective had to be taken in order, every bridge held, every mile of road secured. A single delay, a single broken link could unravel the entire chain. And though Allied intelligence had warned of strong German forces in the Arnhem area, the planners dismissed the reports as exaggerated. Montgomery believed the Germans were broken, that their resistance was crumbling. The truth was far darker. By early September, Germany's armies were battered, but far from destroyed. Along the Dutch border, fragments of elite SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were regrouping, refitting their tanks, and waiting. Arnhem, Montgomery's final objective, sat right in their path. Still, the operation pressed forward. The air over southern England thundered with engines as wave after wave of aircraft took off. From the ground, it looked like the promise of liberation. To those in the air, it was a leap into the unknown. The paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd U.S. Airborne Divisions and the British 1st Airborne Division with the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade sat packed into their planes, faces pale in the dim light. As the planes crossed into enemy territory, anti-aircraft guns opened up. Black bursts of flak blossomed among the clouds, rattling the fuselages. Some planes exploded midair, others limped on with smoke trailing from their engines. Yet, remarkably, the drops were made with relative success. Thousands of parachutes blossomed across the Dutch sky, drifting down into open fields, roads, and canals. Civilians stared upward in wonder. Old men removed their hats. Children waved. A farmer in Oosterbeek later said, "It was like snow. Only the snow brought freedom, but freedom would come at a terrible price." On the first day, things seemed to go according to plan. The American 101st Airborne secured several bridges near Eindhoven, though not without fierce resistance. The 82nd Airborne fought to control the bridge at Nijmegen, one of the largest in Europe, spanning the Wall River. The British 1st Airborne landed near Arnhem, the most distant and most crucial of all the objectives. If they could seize the Arnhem Bridge and hold it until XXX Corps arrived, the Allies would have their road into Germany. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the 1st Airborne, knew the risks. His men were lightly armed and scattered across several drop zones miles from the bridge. Still, they moved quickly, advancing through the suburbs toward the Rhine. By evening, one battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost reached the northern end of the bridge. They dug in, setting up defenses in the surrounding buildings. From their position, they could see the long steel spans stretching across the water intact, glinting in the sunset. "We've got it," Frost radioed, "and we'll hold it." But already, The operation was beginning to unravel. Communications broke down almost immediately. Radios malfunctioned or couldn't reach across the wide landing areas. Urquhart's headquarters lost contact with most of his units. Confusion reigned. Units became separated, unaware of each other's positions. And worst of all, reports began to come in of German armor nearby real armor. Not the token resistance they had been told to expect. From the north and east, columns of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions began to converge on Arnhem. These were battle-hardened veterans, many of them survivors of the Eastern Front, men who had learned to fight in the ruins of Stalingrad and the forests of Kursk. They were not the broken remnants the Allies imagined. They were predators waiting for the right moment to strike. By nightfall, the British airborne troops around Arnhem were isolated. Frost's men held the northern end of the bridge, but German forces controlled the southern approaches. Attempts to reach them were beaten back by tanks and artillery. In the narrow streets of Arnhem, the war became a brutal, intimate struggle, house to house, room to room. Civilians were trapped in the middle of it all. Families huddled in basements as shells shattered their homes. A Dutch nurse named Cornelia ten Boom wrote in her diary, "The walls shook all night. The windows were gone, and the sky flashed red. We prayed, not for victory, but for it to stop." Meanwhile, far to the south, the tanks of XXX Corps rolled north along the single narrow highway that would soon earn its grim nickname, Hell's Highway. The column stretched for miles, armored vehicles, trucks, fuel convoys, all moving along a raised causeway barely wide enough for 2 lanes. On either side, soft Dutch soil made it impossible to maneuver off-road. It was a perfect target. German units, quick to exploit the bottleneck, launched repeated counterattacks along the route. Bridge demolitions, ambushes, and artillery fire turned the advance into a crawl. At sun, the bridge was destroyed just before the British reached it. Engineers worked frantically to build a temporary crossing while paratroopers fought to hold the perimeter. Every delay was deadly. Frost's men at Arnhem were counting the hours, waiting for the rumble of tanks that never came. On the second day, Frost's battalion was surrounded. German tanks began pounding the buildings at point-blank range, reducing them to rubble. Ammunition was running low, and casualties mounted. Yet, the British held their ground with grim resolve. When a German officer sent a message demanding surrender, Frost's reply was short. "Tell your commander to go to hell." For 3 days, the men at the bridge fought with extraordinary courage when they used Piats against tanks, sniper rifles against machine guns, grenades against walls. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. Water and medical supplies ran out. The wounded lay in the ruins, calling for help that could not come. Private Jim Brady later said, "We thought the whole British army was on its way. Every hour we waited for the sound of engines, but all we heard was the enemy getting closer." By the 3rd day, the city of Arnhem had become a graveyard of hope. The streets were littered with burned-out vehicles, collapsed houses, and the dead soldiers and civilians alike. The Rhine flowed silently beneath the bridge, indifferent to the carnage above it. What had begun as a bold stroke of strategic brilliance was dissolving into a slow, suffocating nightmare. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion, which had seized the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge, was surrounded completely by German armor. Tanks of the 9th SS Panzer Division moved through the narrow streets, their cannons firing point-blank into buildings where the British held out. The paratroopers had dug into basements and upper floors, sniping through broken windows, throwing grenades from shattered stairways. They fought like men possessed, outnumbered and outgunned, but unwilling to yield. For many, it had become less about victory and more about endurance. Major Tatham Warder, Frost's second-in-command, famously carried an umbrella into battle, using it to direct traffic and rally men amidst the chaos. When questioned, he quipped that it would prevent him from being shot by his own side since the Germans, he reasoned, would never be so silly as to carry one. Humor was rare in Arnhem that week, but the British had always found a grim sort of laughter in impossible situations. The paratrooper situation, however, was beyond humor. Ammunition was almost gone, food and medical supplies non-existent. The wounded lay in cellars as shells pounded the city. Civilians, trapped with them, offered what comfort they could: bandages torn from curtains, water fetched under fire. One Dutch girl, barely 16, carried messages and supplies through streets swept by machine gun fire. They looked like ghosts, she later said of the paratroopers. Their faces were gray with dust and smoke, their eyes red. But when you spoke to them, they always smiled. Further south, British XXX Corps fought desperately to reach them. The long, thin corridor through Holland, soon infamous as Hell's Highway, was under constant attack. German units had regrouped quickly, striking from both flanks, cutting the road again and again. Each time, engineers and infantry had to fight to reopen it. The flat Dutch countryside offered no cover, only endless fields and ditches. When a tank or truck was hit, the entire column stopped, exposed to artillery and snipers. We were sitting ducks, one British soldier remembered. If you stayed on the road, you got shelled. If you got off the road, you sank, despite the chaos. XXX Corps pressed on. Villages like Valkenswaard, Sun, and Grave were taken in bitter fighting. Bridges were captured, repaired, and crossed, but the advance was too slow. Every hour of delay cost the men at Arnhem another building, another friend. By the time the tanks reached Nijmegen, where the 82nd Airborne was locked in combat for control of the Great Wall Bridge, the situation at Arnhem was already dire. At Nijmegen, one of the most heroic actions of the entire operation unfolded. On September 20th, the 82nd Airborne was ordered to take the bridge from both sides, a nearly impossible task, since the Germans held the far bank in force. The only way across was by boat. Under heavy fire, American paratroopers paddled across the wide and exposed river in flimsy canvas assault boats, their comrades watching helplessly from the near shore. German machine guns cut down the first waves, boats shattered, men sank, the water turning dark with blood, yet they kept going. It was madness. One survivor said, but we had no choice. It was either cross or die. Against all odds, they made it. The Americans stormed the far bank, cleared the bunkers, and captured the bridge intact. It was one of the most daring feats of the war, but even this victory came too late to save Frost's men. At Arnhem, the bridge defenders were down to their last rounds. German tanks blasted the buildings apart, one by one. The smell of cordite and burning plaster filled the air. Frost himself was wounded by shrapnel, but he refused evacuation, still directing his men from a ruined house near the bridge ramp. Hold on, he told them, though he must have known there was nothing left to hold with. On the night of September 20th, the final German assault began. Infantry and armor advanced together, firing into every doorway and window. The British positions, already devastated, could no longer resist. Many men were killed where they stood, others were buried alive in collapsing buildings. When the end came, it was swift and brutal. The surviving paratroopers, out of ammunition and surrounded, were forced to surrender. Of the 700 men who had reached the bridge, barely 100 were still standing when it fell. Frost and his officers were taken prisoner. For them, the war would continue behind barbed wire in German camps. For those who died at Arnhem, there would be no graves, only ruins. But the battle was not yet over. The remnants of the 1st Airborne Division, scattered around Oosterbeek and the woods west of Arnhem, still fought on. General Urquhart, who had been cut off and missing for much of the battle, re-established contact and organized a perimeter around the village. The paratroopers dug trenches in gardens and fields, turning the Dutch countryside into a fortress. Civilians sheltered them, fed them, and suffered beside them. The Germans encircled the pocket and pounded it relentlessly with mortars and artillery. For 8 days, the British held, they called their position the Oosterbeek perimeter, but it was little more than a shrinking patch of mud and blood. The wounded lay in houses converted into aid stations, where doctors worked with bare hands and no morphine. The air stank of smoke and decay, rations were gone, and water was fetched from rain barrels. Yet, even as hope faded, they refused to surrender. To the south, the Poles of the 1st Independent Parachute Brigade finally joined the battle. Delayed by weather, they landed near Driel on September 21st under heavy fire. Their commander, General Stanislaw Sosabowski, begged to be allowed to cross the Rhine and relieve the trapped British, but the river was too wide, the current too strong, and German fire too heavy. Only a few small groups managed to reach Oosterbeek, carrying what little ammunition they could. The rest fought and died on the southern bank, watching helplessly as their allies were crushed. In London, Allied command received the grim reports. The corridor was open only halfway. XXX. Their corps was exhausted. Their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The Germans were throwing everything they had into holding Arnhem. What had been envisioned as a rapid strike to end the war had turned into a slow, grinding disaster. Still, the order came hold as long as possible. Relief would come soon, but by now, no one in Oosterbeek believed it. One paratrooper, writing in a mud-stained notebook, summed up the mood in a single line. We came for victory, we stay for survival. By the dawn of September 23rd, Oosterbeek had ceased to be a town and had become a battlefield of ghosts. What was once a quiet Dutch village filled with tidy gardens and tree-lined streets was now a landscape of splintered homes, cratered lawns, and charred corpses. The 1st Airborne Division, once a proud force of 10,000ers, was reduced to barely 3,000ers, exhausted, wounded, and starving men clinging to a shrinking perimeter on the north bank of the Rhine. The sound never stopped. The sharp cracks of German mortars, the dull thud of artillery, the constant drone of Luftwaffe planes overhead. It was a chorus of destruction that echoed day and night. The men dug deeper into the mud, into gardens and churchyards, anywhere they could find a patch of earth to hide behind. Many hadn't slept properly in days. Their uniforms were soaked, caked in blood and dirt, and their faces hollow with hunger. General Roy Urquhart, who had spent much of the early fighting cut off from his command, now moved among the trenches, muddy and unshaven, offering quiet encouragement. His voice was calm. His words measured an anchor in the chaos. Hold the line, lads, he said. Help's on the way. But even he knew the truth was more fragile than hope. The Germans had thrown everything into crushing the airborne pocket. Mortar shells screamed into gardens, reducing trees to splinters. Tanks prowled the outskirts of Oosterbeek, blasting at any sign of movement. Snipers lurked in the ruins. For civilians trapped within the perimeter, survival was as much a miracle as for the soldiers. Families huddled in cellars, their walls shaking with every explosion. Children whimpered as the roofs above them collapsed. A Dutch woman named Hilda van Limburg later wrote, "The house trembled. The air was thick with dust. We prayed in whispers, and outside, the English kept firing. I do not know who was protecting whom, us or them. Medical stations, hastily set up in basements and churches, overflowed with the wounded. There was no morphine, no clean bandages, and barely any water. The stench of gangrene filled the air. Medics worked with trembling hands, tearing up shirts for dressings, cutting off limbs with kitchen knives heated over candles. It was like a vision of hell, one doctor said later. You could not move without stepping in blood. Despite the suffering, discipline held. The paratroopers were still soldiers, and they still fought. Every German advance was met with fierce resistance. Small units moved through gardens and hedgerows, counterattacking with bayonets and grenades. When ammunition ran low, men used captured weapons. When rations were gone, they ate whatever could be found, apples from smashed orchards, raw potatoes, even horse meat from a dead pack animal. Each night, the British hoped for resupply, and each night, the sky filled with the drone of Allied transport planes, but without proper radio contact, the drops fell wide, many into German hands. The sight of parachutes descending beyond the enemy lines was heartbreaking. Some Dutch civilians risked their lives to retrieve the containers, crawling through fields under fire to drag them back toward the British lines. A few made it, most did not. Across the river, on the southern bank, the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade was fighting its own hopeless battle. General Stanisław Sosabowski had begged Allied command to allow an immediate crossing to reinforce the trapped British, but the river was a death trap. German guns on the far bank swept it continuously, and the boats were few. When the Poles finally tried to cross near Driel, the current was too strong and the night too dark. Only a few dozen men made it across. The rest were swept downstream or cut to pieces. Sosabowski's frustration was legendary. My men came to fight, he told the British liaison officer bitterly, not to watch others die. but his hands were tied by orders and the river itself. He could only stand on the southern shore, hearing the endless thunder from Oosterbeek, knowing what was happening to the men on the far side. By September 24th, the perimeter was collapsing. The Germans brought in more armor, pushing closer with each assault. The British were down to their last magazines, their last grenades. A single shot was a precious thing, often saved for the surest target. Yet, still they fought, still they refused to yield. It was not bravery anymore. One survivor wrote later, it was defiance, pure, stubborn defiance. That night, the rain came again, heavy and cold. It soaked the trenches, turned the ground to mud, and muffled the sound of the dying. Amid the storm, the decision was made there would be no more holding the line. The operation was finished. The order from Corps Command was clear: evacuate the remnants across the Rhine. The message was passed quietly from trench to trench. There would be no bugles, no fanfare, only silence, and the plan, codenamed Operation Berlin, would begin after midnight. Engineers on the southern bank had assembled assault boats and ferries under the cover of darkness. The crossing would be perilous, but it was the only hope of saving what remained of the division. As night fell on September 25th, the survivors of the 1st Airborne prepared to withdraw. Some wept openly as they passed among their wounded comrades, many of whom could not be moved. "Leave us," one dying officer said. "Get back and tell them we tried." Others clung to their rifles, refusing to go until ordered. Civilians, too, came to say goodbye, offering silent farewells, pressing small gifts, a crucifix, a scarf, a piece of bread into the soldiers' hands. At 10 p.m., the evacuation began. In small groups, the men slipped through the trees toward the river, moving like shadows. The rain fell harder now, the wind howling through the ruins. German flares lit the sky in ghostly bursts, revealing figures stumbling through the mud, carrying wounded comrades on their backs. When the flares faded, the darkness closed in again. At the riverbank, the scene was chaos. Men crowded the shore, whispering, calling for boats. Some swam into the icy water, desperate to reach safety. Many never made it. The current was too strong, the fire from the far bank too heavy. Engineers and Canadian boat crews worked tirelessly, rowing back and forth under fire, hauling men into the boats until the hulls were nearly swamped. A young corporal later said, "You didn't think, you just rowed. You rowed until your arms stopped working, and then you rowed some more." By dawn, the evacuation was over. The fog lifted to reveal an empty, shattered riverbank. The men who had not escaped lay scattered among the wreckage, silent and still. Of the 10,000 who had landed north of the Rhine, fewer than 2,000 made it back across alive. For those who survived, there was no cheer of triumph, only exhaustion and grief. They had come so close to victory, only to see it crumble into tragedy. The bridge at Arnhem, the bridge too far, had fallen, and with it, the dream of ending the war by Christmas. When daylight broke on September 26, 1944, the Rhine was calm again, its surface disturbed only by the drifting wreckage of boats and the faint shimmer of oil slicks. On the northern bank, smoke still curled from the ruins of Oosterbeek and Arnhem. The battle was over. The last paratroopers who hadn't made it across the river had been taken prisoner at dawn. They emerged from their foxholes and cellars, some limping, others carried on stretchers, all filthy, starving, and hollow-eyed. Their captors, many of them German veterans of the Eastern Front, looked at the survivors not with triumph, but with a kind of grim respect. They fought like lions, one German officer reportedly said. It was an honor to meet them in battle. Across the Rhine, on the southern bank, the men who had escaped sat in the stunned silence. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp chill that seeped through their uniforms. Medics moved quietly among them, tending wounds, wrapping blankets around shivering shoulders. The survivors of the 1st Airborne Division, what was left of them, waited for orders. Too dazed to speak, some stared across the water, trying to see through the drifting fog, as if refusing to believe they had left comrades behind. Others simply bowed their heads, lost in exhaustion and disbelief. The scale of the defeat was devastating. Of the roughly 10,000 men of the British 1st Airborne Division who had landed near Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 had escaped. Over 1,400 were dead, and more than 6,000 had been captured. Among the Poles of General Sosabowski's brigade, hundreds were lost in their futile attempts to cross the river. American casualties were lighter, but still severe, nearly 3,000 killed or wounded in the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and many more among the ground forces of XXX Corps. In total, Operation Market Garden cost the Allies around 17,000 casualties, one of the highest tolls of the entire European campaign. The German losses were also significant, about 8,000 men, but their victory had been absolute. For them, Arnhem was proof that the Reich, though battered, still had fight left in it. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, written off by Allied intelligence as shattered remnants, had shown they could still hold their own against the best airborne troops in the world. It was a bitter revelation for the Allies, who only weeks before had believed Germany on the brink of collapse. In the immediate aftermath, the mood within the Allied High Command was one of shock and uneasy silence. Field Marshal Montgomery, the architect of the plan, initially called the operation 90% successful. In his view, the airborne troops had done their duty magnificently. It was only the failure to reach Arnhem in time that had prevented total victory. But his words rang hollow. Even Eisenhower, who had supported the plan despite reservations, admitted privately that Market Garden had been a terrible gamble. The soldiers who fought it didn't need reports or statistics to understand what had gone wrong. They had lived it, the miscommunications, the broken radios, the delays, the endless miles of exposed road. They had watched reinforcements arrive a day too late, seen bridges blown up seconds before reaching them, seen comrades die waiting for tanks that never came. It was all there. One British sergeant said later, bravery, heroism, sacrifice, and none of it was enough. We were sent too far, and we stayed too long. For the Dutch civilians, the failure of Market Garden was catastrophic. The towns and villages along the corridor, Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem, and dozens more had been ravaged by days of fighting. Thousands were killed or made homeless. When the Allies were forced to pull back, German forces returned with vengeance. The Dutch who had aided the paratroopers were hunted, imprisoned, or executed. Arnhem itself was emptied by German order. Its surviving residents were driven out, their homes looted and burned. The once prosperous city became a ghost town. Worse still, the failure at Arnhem prolonged the war in the Netherlands. The Allies had hoped to liberate the country before winter, but with Market Garden's collapse, the front lines froze south of the Rhine. The Germans cut off food shipments to the still occupied northern provinces, leading to what the Dutch would remember as the Hunger Winter. In the months that followed, more than 20,000 civilians starved to death. We waited for the Allies. One Dutch survivor wrote later, "We could see the sky where they had come from, but they never came again." Meanwhile, the survivors of the 1st Airborne were withdrawn to England. When they landed, there were no parades, no fanfare. The men were too tired to celebrate. Many could barely stand as they stepped off the boats. In the barracks at their home base in Lincolnshire, an officer read out the casualty lists in silence. Names were met not with words, but with bowed heads. It was like listening to a litany of ghosts. One soldier said, among the officers, the guilt was unbearable. General Urquhart, who had led his men with quiet courage, was haunted by the thought that he had led them to their deaths. John Frost, captured at the bridge and now a prisoner of war, refused to call the operation a failure. He called it a tragedy. "We did everything we could," he said years later. "We held the bridge, but the bridge did not save us." And then there was General Sosabowski, the fiery Polish commander who had warned from the beginning that the plan was too risky, that the distances were too great, and the intelligence too optimistic. His warnings had been ignored, and afterward, he was scapegoated for the failure. The British High Command accused him of being uncooperative, and his command was eventually removed. It was a cruel injustice. Decades later, the British government would formally apologize and award his brigade the honors they had earned in blood, but in 1944 there was only silence. For Montgomery, the lesson was one of humility, though he never fully admitted it. In later years, He would insist Market Garden had been a noble failure, and in a sense, it did not break the German front or end the war, but it did demonstrate something enduring about the Allied spirit courage that did not yield even when hope was gone. The paratroopers at Arnhem, the Americans at Nijmegen, the Poles at Driel, and the tankers of XXX Corps all fought with a valor that history would not forget. The operation's legacy, though, was not just military, it was human. The people of Arnhem and Oosterbeek never forgot the men who came from the sky and fought for their freedom. Every year, long after the war ended, Dutch families returned to the Oosterbeek cemetery to lay flowers on the graves of the fallen. School children would adopt those graves, learning the names of the men buried there, writing letters to them as if they were still alive. In 1946, when the survivors of the 1st Airborne returned to visit the site of their battle, they were stunned by what they found: clean white crosses, flowers everywhere, and Dutch families standing silently among them. It was as if the town itself had become their memorial. One veteran said, "They kept faith when we could not. Operation Market Garden had been born of daring and optimism, and it ended in loss and humility. But within that failure lay something unbreakable, the courage of ordinary men asked to do the impossible, and who, for 9 terrible days, almost did." In the words of one of Frost's men, written years later in his diary, "We came to hold the bridge," and we did. But it was not the bridge that mattered in the end. It was the men who stood upon it. The Rhine still flows beneath the rebuilt bridge at Arnhem. Its official name is now John Frost Bridge. Each year, as the Dutch lay their wreaths and the bugles sound across the quiet water, the words echo again through time, those words that defined both the battle and its lesson for all who came after. It was a bridge too far.